So tonight we are covering still life painting in the Dutch Republic specifically. Now, still life as a genre did extend into other European countries, and we will see that it does have kind of its foundation in other kind of time periods. But when you consider the specific genre of still life, it really originated in the Dutch Republic. Actually, a lot of what we see that's not, biblical scenes or mythological scenes, those are typically titled history paintings. So when you think of landscapes, florals, still lives, that really is stemming from the Dutch Republic, because they are not commissioning, these more religious or mythological scenes anymore, right? These history scenes, because of their break with the Roman Catholic Church, because this is now officially not only a republic, so not only a political shift, but it's also a religious shift, as well, as it is now more identified with Protestantism rather than Catholicism. So that means that the art, of course, has shifted. There we go. Now, there were precedents of artists that were obviously studying things other than, figural composition. So they weren't just studying the human body. This is very Italian. This is a painting done by Caravaggio. So artists would study certain elements such as florals or landscapes in order to incorporate them into whatever narrative they were painting. We also have an example here on the right side of the screen of kind of an earlier, proto still life, if you will. There were studies kind of in collections. So the idea of collecting was starting to become very popular, not only in the Dutch Republic, but in much of Europe. And so artists were kind of interested in rendering these things. So there was interest, but the specific genre really comes along in the Dutch Republic. Now, this is an early Northern Netherlandish image, and this is more of like a marketplace, but these are kind of the forerunners of what we would consider still lives. And these are kind of, when I say forerunners, you can obviously see there's a narrative in the background. Now, although this was happening kind of in this religious split, it wasn't quite to the 17th century. I want to say this one's dated to about 1580 or 1590. But there is a scene, a narrative scene back here that's meant to mimic kind of like a discreetly religious scene, right? Of kind of, this would probably be the flight into Egypt, but they put it in kind of a Dutch context. And you have, figures also represented. But then the main focus is this kind of market scene, or this meat market per se. And this was kind of the forerunner prototype of what later became very, very popular. So we're going to be going over florals. We're going to be going over memento moris, which kind of includes skulls and other aspects kind of to mark ideas of death. And then we're going to be going over breakfast scenes, dinner scenes, prompt still lives, and I'll explain what those are. But these still lives had their own categories pretty much, and we've kind of classified them into one big still life category, but they really encompassed a lot of different things, and each had their kind of heyday of popularity. Now, this would be considered a memento mori, and I'm sure at some point during some of these lectures I've mentioned it, but just for you to know, memento moris are meant to be reminders of your own mortality, right? They're meant to be reminders that you are human, you live, and then someday you die, pretty much. Now, it wasn't really meant to be this dark omen by any means. It was meant to simply remind the viewer that in a religious sphere, in a religious setting, that there is something else, right? This is not all that life has to offer. There's hope, there's resurrection within this contextualized Christian faith, right? But it is meant to remind the viewer of kind of the vanity surrounding life, surrounding kind of the ownership of objects, social hierarchies at play, there are money, wealth. There are lots of things going on. And the reason memento moris became relatively popular in Dutch society is because this very democratic republic was now born, and it's kind of where we see the birth of capitalism itself, right? And so there was a lot of wealth coming into this very small and new nation. And that created a lot of anxiety and tensions, because not only was there this Protestant faith, Protestant Christian faith, that kind of ixnayed and condemned like this overabundance of wealth, or really, I would not want to say they condemned just wealth in general. They didn't condemn it, more so that they condemned the attitudes behind it, right? Were you sinful with your wealth? Did you get it through cheating certain people, stepping over certain people? So that's kind of what they condemn. So there's this one religious aspect of wealth, to be very weary of it, that your identity is not in this world, but it's in the heavenly realm, right? It's in the supernatural world. And then there was also a tension between how much wealth was actually coming into the Dutch Republic, that was starting at the beginning with these trade companies and people that had invested in such things, merchants, certain guilds, and it just trickled down into every aspect of Dutch life that people were doing relatively well. So this idea of tension is really starting to be played out in still lives, and particularly with memento moris. Now, you can see in this depiction, there are other things in the image aside from the skull. We will talk a little bit more about how artists are playing with kind of like light and reflection, as seen in this goblet and this glass. This is perhaps meant to symbolize, you can actually see the burning wick right here. You can see the smoke right here coming through the background. But what is interesting is that there are other memento moris at play here besides the skull. This burning, I'm sorry, this burning wick right here is kind of meant to symbolize that same thing. You can actually see memento moris in skulls, in flies, typically, in certain depictions of animals, and in certain other elements, such as this kind of burning wick right here. That is really meant to, it's all meant to represent the temporality of life, right? So this is very temporal, and you should be reflecting on eternal things. And we can actually see very similar elements here, right? So artists would use the same elements for their compositions, particularly if they sold well on the open market. So they're not really getting large commissions from very wealthy patrons anymore, because everything is kind of not so much equal. I don't want you to think that there weren't wealthy people existing in the Dutch Republic, but the fact that this open market is starting to expand, and more clients, particularly this kind of like this kind of wealthier middle class, is starting to come to the forefront of Dutch society. And so they're interested in buying these paintings. And so artists would often repeat motifs in terms of what sells well. And so it was kind of an experimental thing, back and forth. And we obviously have a memento mori right here on the left-hand side. And I just wanted to show you some examples, because skulls kind of, they tend to pop up every now and then, but they really are their own specific genre, as we'll see studying other things such as florals. Now, florals were very, very popular in the Dutch Republic. There was actually a tulip craze that happened. I think the height of tulip mania, as scholars have called it, was 1637. And the Dutch loved their tulips, and they still do today. But this was because tulips were not native to the Netherlands at the time. They actually came from the East. They came from Turkey, so the Ottoman Empire at the time. And they were sent by the emperor to the Roman emperor in the 16th century, and made their way over to the Netherlands eventually. And so people just couldn't get enough of them, but they did very well in the Dutch soil. And so you can actually still go over there today and see all the beautiful tulip fields when they bloom. So there's still much and kind of an obsession that started in the 16th century, which is pretty cool. Tulips had a really great variety of shapes and colors. And so artists really could take certain tulips and they could practice, right? Practice rendering formal elements, practice light, practice shadow, rendering such things. And they did very well on the open market, as you can imagine. People would hang them in their kitchens, people would hang them in their living rooms, along their hallways. So they did very well. But what we should note is that these bouquets, may look very realistic to us, and they definitely do. You can see, I mean, you would probably assume that this was a real bouquet. You know, we've seen gorgeous bridal bouquets. Usually we've seen people give flowers for presents or special occasions. And so we've seen very elaborate bouquets, but what's interesting is that all of these blooms would have been happening at different times in this season. And so what artists would do is that it seems as though they're painting from life, and you would assume kind of it being still life. But what they would do is they would do kind of intricate studies of certain florals. They would take those studies back, whether they be sketchings or etchings or however they decided to work, take it back to their studio, and then render it all in a painting, particularly flowers that bloom in different seasons. So that gives us kind of this impossible bouquet, and it's very elaborate, it's very ornate, very detailed, and it's meant to seem realistic, but it's also meant to trick the viewer. And this idea of tricking the viewer was a concept found in Dutch art that was just very, very popular, right? It's this idea of constructed artifice, pretty much, realistic artifice, I guess you could call it. And the Dutch just loved it. And that extended into other genres that we're not even going to go into. It extended into interior scenes, church interior scenes, landscapes. This idea of artificially constructing a scene and making it seem realistic to the viewer was, I mean, just got them going, right? So this was a part of floral still lives. It was kind of this impossible and elaborate construction of putting these flowers and these blooms together that would not exist in reality. And that really kind of transferred into their depiction of other still lives. So typically of table scenes, which is primarily what we're going to be focusing on for the rest of this course. But when we look at these table scenes, we can see that they are definitely elaborately constructed, right? And they've got a lot of very realistic looking details. And these things were real, you know, these flowers were real. They're just put in kind of an impossible situation. More than likely, the artist was working with most of these elements in these kind of table still lives, but he was incorporating kind of what you see, fruits, maybe certain details to make these a little bit more ornate. But you can actually see here, this is a nautilus shell right here. And so that signifies that's not native to the Netherlands. So this is actually signifying a part of Dutch trade. So they likely got these from the Caribbean. I'm forgetting where this shell actually originated from. It could have originated somewhere from Africa, but it was alluding to the fact that Dutch trade was booming at the time. Not only did they have the Dutch East India Company that we all probably know, they also established the Dutch West India Company. And that brought them into communication on a global scale, which we'll actually be talking about in a couple of weeks. We'll be talking about the impact of global trade, not only from the Netherlands, but of the world, particularly with the Mughal court in India. But these still lives were meant to reflect not only an elaborate scene, potentially belonging in a wealthy patron's home, but they were also meant to reflect just the richness and the success of Dutch trade. And then that kind of brings us to scenes such as this. So paintings of food on tables were very popular, and they were, you know, realistic assemblages. They were painted, these were definitely painted from life, but it was probably done in sections, so painted from life, but just not all together. So likely the artist would have been, you know, seen this pie and painted this pie, and then he would have painted kind of certain goblets that he would have seen, probably this one in the background. So the painting was done in stages, pretty much, particularly of food, because you can't put all of this food together and expect it to hold out for the rest of the painting. So that's kind of how these still lives, aside from florals, worked. But what artists became interested in is not only what was of interest on the art market, so not only what people were buying, but these paintings became kind of foundations for experimentation. So this is where artists could work out how to render light and reflection and how to maybe transfer that to a very serious painting, because there were still commissions happening, just not on the grand scale that you saw in the Southern Netherlands or more Catholic countries. But there were still serious formal elements that artists were trying to figure out, and still life became a way to kind of render that. So they're playing with light sources here. Obviously, there's an above light source, typically a window that's shining down. And this particular artist is playing with the idea of reflection and light, not only in the glass, but how that light transfers through the liquid and reverberates back into the composition, right? So he's also looking at particularly kind of like this silver right here, how a reflection would be done on different sources and how that reflection actually reflects back on this plate. So there's a lot of complicated formal elements going into these particular still lives. And one of the things that makes still lives approachable and fun to look at that maybe we haven't considered is that they kind of teeter on it is a still life, a still moment, but it borders on that level of anxiety, right? And we can see that because look at this plate as it extends from the table. It seems like it's going to fall off, right? So it's extending into our picture plane almost. It's extending towards the viewer. The painter or the artist has foreshortened it. That way it's more three-dimensional, extends into us, but it stays there, right? So it's the kind of this anticipation. It's this idea of anticipated movement that makes these scenes kind of pull us back and forth around the composition. And of course, kind of that movement kind of gets our eye looking around the rest of the composition to consider, where did this goblet come from? Where was this glass made? Because, obviously glass mirrors certain things, were pretty valuable items. And the presence of certain fruits and foods also tell us about kind of this idea of global trade. So I think you'll be able to see it in a different slide, so I might wait to bring that. But another element that artists like to do to kind of give us this idea of anticipated movement and to kind of really artistically show off is they would put a lemon peel here, and that would extend into our plane as well. So it would function in the same way that this plate right here is functioning in this scene on the right side. And here you actually have all of the elements combined in this kind of more chaotic structure. You have the lemon peel, which you're going to see repeatedly, and then you have the plate kind of jutting out. And even now they've added a knife to kind of jut out into our picture plane. And this really is to establish this idea of movement within something that's meant to be still, right? It's anticipation. And all of this really plays into the lingering anxieties that this culture had and how wealthy they were becoming and how much they were growing, and then what to do with all of that wealth. And it was really, people like to describe it as like the secular versus the religious, but I typically think that happens in whatever culture, that when a culture booms economically, right, there's kind of this anxiety of what do we now do with all this wealth? How do we handle it responsibly? And that's what a lot of people, or what a lot of scholars are saying that these paintings are kind of alluding to. And I just wanted to consider some elements that you may not typically see. So particularly in this one on the right, you can actually see a bug right here. I think it's a bee, and he's chilling out on this piece of bread. You can actually see a butterfly. So there are sometimes in these compositions, there will be bugs and certain elements that come through to try to inform us of movement, trying to add a little bit of, what would you say, spice to the composition that maybe had not been there previously. But when you look at certain elements, so you can look at like citrus fruits, you can look at certain things that are not native to Dutch society. And when you look at certain silver, you start to wonder, where did all of this stuff come from? Because not all of these things originated in the Dutch Republic itself. And you really start to see the influence of other cultures in Dutch society through this aspect of global trade. And here you can actually see, let's see. getting my slides. There we go. Well, it's not this one. There's one that specifically alludes to peppercorn, which was not a spice originally coming from the Netherlands. Most of the spices did not originate there. There was this thing called the spice trade that allude to it. So pepper and sugar in particular, when they're represented here, are meant to represent this idea of global trade. But unfortunately, these things, or these still lives, don't really show us the darker aspect of what happened in the Dutch global trade, which obviously was slavery. Now, in the Netherlands, slavery was illegal. So you could not, another human being could not own anybody. But when these trade routes were established, they were established in countries that slavery was not illegal. So in a lot of the processing, what we consider this Dutch golden age, it was a golden age for certain people, but not for all people, particularly kind of all the people represented in the background of how these items came to be in Dutch hands, right? So typically, some of these items, some of these foodstuffs, some of these, more ornate, you've got depictions of lacquered boxes you can see in other Dutch genre scenes. You've got depictions of certain paintings you can see originating from other countries. So what you see is not always the true story, right? It's kind of an artifice put forth by the artist, but it really ignores all the stories of how these things are coming to be in the Dutch Republic specifically. And there are quite a few museums in the Netherlands that are beginning to focus on that particular history. Not to say that we should just hate still alive because bad things happened in the past. That's not what I'm saying. But it is important to reconcile with history and understand that in the establishment of some of these trade routes and in some countries, slavery was the real deal. And we need to know that when we approach certain things, because it layers how we're meant to see it. And it also layers how people throughout history would have interacted with these items themselves. Now, these more elaborate dinner scenes are called pronk still lives, which it's really meant, these more than anything are meant to display kind of excessive wealth. So these were very attractive to kind of emerging middle class, upper middle class citizens, right, that were wanting to dip into, that were acquiring this new wealth, wanting to dip into kind of this upper echelon of society. So these things were definitely very, very popular. And so they're called pronk still lives, just in case you missed it. But they typically have kind of this very ornate banquet of food laid out. We definitely get some meats here. We get some crab here, meaning, this person is wealthy. You've got an assortment of fruits and citrus fruits, grapes, and you've got, all of these kind of very elaborate tableware, right? And you've got even the materials, even the fabrics kind of extending out from the table itself. It really is this idea of excessiveness, right, of wealth. And what's interesting and how artists are playing with this is that you can actually see a reflection of a man coming into the scene right here in this silver, well, it's not a goblet, this silver vase right here, or vase, or pouring jug, silver jug, that's what it is, a jug. You can actually see this person coming in the reflection, and you can see this silver plate reflected too with these cups. They've even rendered kind of these goblet cups right here. And so they're really studying every single little detail to make these works, right? Because this is an experiment for them. This is how they are rendering light and reflection. And this idea of the mirror, really a lot of art historians that are interested in kind of like psychoanalysis or different, kind of applying scientific methods to art history in general, really love this psychoanalysis of what the mirror and how it reflects Dutch culture and whatnot. But artists are very much interested in this because there are a lot of scientific discoveries happening in the 17th century. Now, pronk still lives also typically feature kind of these more exotic animals, so animals that are not obviously found in the Dutch Republic, such as monkeys, such as certain birds. But they also represent animals that would be found there, because these are meant to be, even though they're meant to be elaborate constructions, the Dutch Republic and its people are still very proud of what they're building, right? That they're building this new society outside of the confines of the Catholic Church. And so all of these paintings, all of this kind of Dutch visual culture is pouring into this construction of a larger Dutch identity, a larger Republican identity, right? So you should see these inclusions of kind of these exotic animals or exotic fruits, even exotic flowers, is really a reflection of what they're doing and their connections to the rest of the world. It's not really meant to be like a true picture of what's happening in the rest of the world. It's meant to be how that connects them to this world, right? So it's very much in the Dutch perspective and in the Dutch context. And here's another even more elaborate still life. They just kind of keep going and getting fancier and fancier. But we actually see a parrot here in the corner, which, because of the way the PowerPoint is set up, I cut the top of the parrot off. But I'm sorry about that if you were really wanting to see the parrot. But we have a lobster, we have some live animals, a dog, a monkey. This particular dog is very popular in Netherlandish art, even earlier Netherlandish art. You may think of Jan van Eyck's the Arnold Feeney portrait, that marriage portrait that every art history class teaches you about. You can see cherries and grapes and all sorts of things, a variety of meats, kind of a Dutch pie right there. And you also have the lemon peel that artists just love to use. And these constructions just become more and more elaborate and more excessive as wealth in the Dutch Republic begins to grow. And then when we kind of go back to kind of this idea of anxiety and even artifice, we see certain elements that are very, very strange. In many of these images, you'll see certain silverware or dinnerware, cookware that is kind of tumbled over. And it's meant to really, a lot of scholars that are more probably religiously inclined, more interested in theology, they kind of consider it as a take of the mortality, right? It's not necessarily a memento mori, but it's an idea of the temporal and the secular versus what the mind should be focused on, which is kind of this eternal and supernatural, right, within the Christian faith. But some scholars just think it's another way to depict kind of this anxiety, this underlying anxiety within the culture that's just growing extremely fast and becoming very wealthy. And this idea of artifice is actually found, this curtain motif, typically this idea of like the trick of the eye, that did not originate from the Dutch Republic, right? We actually see that in ancient art as well. I'm wanting to say some philosopher, I don't think it was Plato, but it might have been. No, it was somebody in antiquity that talked about being able to trick someone by painting a window and painting a window pane, and that they came and they went to open the window pane, or they went to touch the painting in some way, not knowing that it was actually a painting. And so this idea of artifice actually has its roots in antiquity itself, but is now put in kind of this very Dutch context of this still life, right? It's almost like you're almost wanting to move the curtain away from the still life. And you actually see this in a lot of other representations in certain genre scenes, in interior and church interior scenes, which perhaps we can do a lecture over as well. Let's see if it will let me. There we go. Well, and so I guess that's my last slide. I thought I included one other, but just to wrap up this lecture, and I'll move back to this one because it's one of my favorites. Just to wrap up this lecture is that still lives are typically, people don't typically think that they are as complicated as they actually are, but they really are not just studies of what is in front of us or what was in front of people at the time, but they're really kind of artificial constructions to display the wealth and the growth of Dutch society itself, and to display certain tenets of what this new culture was trying to do in constructing its own cultural identity. So much so that the art itself began to change, because when you think of Baroque art, you typically think of elaborate Italian or French art. You think of Versailles, right? You think of King Louis and all the things that he paid, all the things that he commissioned, just these elaborate, huge paintings and just very ornate architectural structures. But that was not happening in the Dutch Republic. The Baroque in the Dutch played out very differently, because this society was becoming more democratic per se, right? It was a republic. And so it was not run by a monarchy. It was not run by the papacy, but by certain elected officials called stadholders. So what you need to do when you consider these things is not consider them as boring or not full of drama like other Baroque periods and other geographical locations, but you just approach this as a new culture constructing their own identity, particularly through the visual culture, particularly through the art that we see. And so in that sense, still life becomes a site where artists are experimenting with certain things, where they're showing what they're interested in, whether it be science, ideas of reflection. You can definitely see ideas of ocular theory. So this idea of the eye and how it interprets light, and then how that light constructs an image, that was very popular in Dutch society at the time. And artists definitely keyed in and honed in on that, because so many writings were being done. Botanical studies were also being done from around the world. Botanical books were being written by all sorts of people and then taken back and constructed and painted by artists. So all of these things are going on. This idea of global trade and economic wealth was happening, and it was all fueling kind of what we see today, and it fuels some of our favorite still lives to look at.